Thank you, Adi. So I'm very happy to welcome you to the final session of this day of political concepts. Two speakers in order of appearance. Ben Parker, to my right, teaches in the English department at Brown. He received his BA and then his PhD from Columbia University with a dissertation on recognition scenes in the Victorian novel, in Victorian fiction, rather. He works generally on the history and theory of the novel, and specifically in some way on Henry James. He's published many essays in leading journals, such as New Literary History, Novel, Mediations, Film Quarterly, N+1, the Los Angeles Review of Books, artforum.com, and the Paris Review Daily. He's currently writing a book called The Awful Victorian Plot, and he will speak on the concept disruption. Our second speaker to my left, Anthony Bogues, is a political theorist, intellectual historian, writer and curator, and currently director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University, and the Asa Mise Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory. He is also an honorary research professor at the University of Cape Town. His work focuses, in some very general way, on Caribbean and African politics, as well as Haitian, Caribbean, and African art. And his numerous distinguished publications include Caliban's Freedom, The Early Political Thought of C.L.R. James, 1997, Black Heretics and Black Prophets, Radical Political Intellectuals, 2003, and Empire of Liberty, Power, Freedom, and Desire, 2010. Amongst his edited work are a significant two-volume study of Caribbean intellectual and literary history, Afterman Towards the Human, Critical Essays on Sylvia Wynter, 2005, and very recently, the George Lamming Reader, The Aesthetics of Decolonization. He will speak to us today on the concept disobedience.
Thank you, and thanks also to Tim and Adi for organizing this and inviting me. The concept is disruption. Am I speaking appropriately? It's okay. Since the election, the New York Times has published 4 op-ed pieces about Trump with disruption somewhere in the title. How is disruption defined by these various writers? For Thomas Edsall, it is the loss of traditional norms and institutional constraints in the era of social media, especially the capture of the Republican Party by outsiders like Trump and Bannon. For Peter Vayner and Greg Wiener, separate, who both invoke Burkean conservatism, disruption is the chaos, disarray, and entropy on display in Trump's tumultuous acts and chaotic temperament and his flouting of the customs of his office. For Francis Fukuyama, continuing the thesis of an earlier book, The Great Disruption, disruption refers to the drawbacks to, the risks and hiatuses accompanying, the thrust of an unbuffered, globalized technological capitalism, to which the rise of autocratic threats to institutional liberalism is understood as so much blowback. So, for the neoconservatives who fill the back pages of the New York Times, the political valence of disruption fits entirely within the everyday meaning of the word, as a breakdown or a halt in proceedings, which you find in a phrase like service disruption. Quote, the act of breaking asunder, a breach, rent, delaceration, end quote. That's all from Samuel Johnson's dictionary, 1755. This same everyday usage can also be found in Hillary Clinton's memoir of the election, What Happened?, where we learned that Bernie Sanders was not running for president, quote, to make sure a Democrat won the White House. He got in to disrupt the Democratic Party, end quote. What she means is that Bernie played spoiler. He junked up the works and upset her plans. She is not saying that she found Bernie's ideas catalyzing or innovative, which is the second meaning that I now turn to. So, sense two. During the Republican primary, Jeb Bush, the pathetic once frontrunner, now branded forever as low energy after Trump's insult campaign, attempted to promote himself as a disruptor. In doing so, he was invoking a familiar buzzword from Silicon Valley, venture capitalists, and the empty hype of business school jargon. In this usage, disruption no longer means a break in continuity. Disruption is instead the restless Heraclitean flux itself. Innovation and creative destruction now appear as the continuous movement internal to economic being, while stagnation and obsolescence become sticking points, obstacles. This is all dizzying nonsense. As Jill Lepore wrote in a 2014 New Yorker essay, disruption, in this sense, is the circular repackaging of the ideologies of progress or evolution, with the difference that it purports to be descriptive rather than evaluative. Disruption is, quote, what happens when the invisible hand replaces the hand of God as explanation and justification, end quote. So it was laughable in one way that Jeb Bush, the embodiment of the Republican establishment, should market himself as unconventional or an outsider. But in another way, since disruption just names the nihilism and valuelessness of neoliberal ideology, he was perfectly correct to do so. The rhetorical move here is to arbitrarily position, for example, charter schools as disrupting the entrenched interests of teachers' unions, so the agent of austerity is thereby cast in the role of guerrilla cadre, and its opponent becomes the Maginot Line. The first meaning of disruption, the neoconservative and everyday sense, is an undesirable external break, especially the violation of pieties and cherished norms. The second meaning, Silicon Valley and Jeb Bush, reconceives disruption as the heedless churn of innovative subversion in which the catastrophic waste of capitalism is simply ontologized as the fact of incessant transformation. A third meaning we could then deduce is their pseudo-dialectical synthesis in which disruption becomes the ascendant negative moment that solicits a contrary saving movement under the guise of seeming loss and injury. Recall then one of the memorably idiotic and shameful moments of the left during the election, the Lacanian Marxist philosopher Slavoj Žižek's endorsement of Donald Trump. In an interview for British News, Žižek echoed Trump's own red-faced and rambling campaign rhetoric, namely that Trump's insurgent candidacy marked an endpoint for the stagnant elite governance of the status quo. Quote, Trump disturbed the implicit consensus of the political order, end quote, opening up a space of possibility and reorientation. If Trump were to win, Žižek prophesied, quote, it will be a kind of big awakening. New political processes will be set in motion, will be triggered, end quote. Where Hillary Clinton, by contrast, stands for absolute inertia. Of course, this paradoxical logic of preferring the greater of two evils, not the lesser, has its classic statement in Marx's Poverty of Philosophy, when he writes, it is the bad side that produces the movement which makes history by constituting struggle. Going even further back, it is a restatement of the fortunate fall in Christian theology, prophesying that all Trump's malice served but to bring forth infinite goodness, grace, and mercy, but on himself treble confusion, wrath, and vengeance poured. So while Žižek sees Trump as a menace and a calamity, he detects behind the Trump phenomenon a cunning of reason, where impulses of collectivity and justice will be solicited and asserted in the fray of history. And defined in this way, disruption means something like a painful but necessary detour into contradiction and disarray. Before turning to conceptual matters, it is worth introducing here an empirical counterpoint to the above descriptions, namely the claim that Trump has not been disruptive. Corey Robin has argued that Trump's presidency so far has been spectacularly weak and ineffective. Trump has, quote, given up or has been beaten back on multiple fronts of foreign policy, on free trade, on infrastructure spending, on the wall, and more. He suffered at the hands of his party a humiliating a humiliating defeat on healthcare, end quote. And Samuel Moyn writes, the president's most outrageous policies have been successfully obstructed, leaving largely those any Republican president would have implemented anyways through executive order, end quote. It is also worth noting areas of continuity. Despite Trump's isolationist positions, the Senate overwhelmingly passed a $700 billion defense bill, which was more than Trump had asked for, with only 4 Democrats voting nay. And in August, it was reported that the US was deporting fewer people under Trump than under Obama, a rate of 17,000 deportations per month, which is about half of Obama's peak of 34,000. Did this in Trump seem disruptive? It would be foolish, of course, to say that everything has been business as usual, but I am not enthusiastic about the most commonly proposed measures to oppose the supposed Trumpian disruption. Either a call for the steadying hand of lifelong military professionals or the immolation of impeachment proceedings. So, my preliminary contentions are that the widespread understanding of Trump as disruptive is incoherent and debilitating for further analysis, and that oppositional strategies that invoke alternatingly the vulnerability of norms, institutions, and order, and then turn around and grant sweeping powers and great dignity to same, are also inadequate. In all of the above usages, disruption is essentially descriptive in the sense of the play-by-play commentary in a sports broadcast. It rehearses the inventory of existing positions, the strategic alignment of forces, but then substitutes labeling for analysis. I submit, once something has been labeled disruptive, we have learned precisely nothing about it. For the rest of my time, I want to propose a concept of disruption starting instead from the analytical lever of subjectivity, rather than the play-by-play approach of labeling X's and O's in their stultifying collisions. And to be sure, although Zizek speaks of a big awakening, which has a certain subjective ring to it, he means it only as a kind of equal and opposite reaction on the model of Newtonian billiard balls. My claim is that only new forms of subjectivity should count for us as disruptions. Anything else is simply moving the food around on the plate. The Trumpian order, if it is to be broken asunder or breached, cannot simply be resisted with the positive elements at hand. I turn now to 3 philosophical contributions to the thinking of disruption. The work of Giorgio Agamben, specifically his terminology of exception on one hand and deactivation on the other. Simone Weil's vocabulary of decreation as interrupting what she variously calls force, gravity, and necessity. And Alain Badiou's concept of the event, what he calls a perturbation of the order of the world. For each of these authors, we will want to know where the disruption to the order of things is supposed to come from, such that it be a disruption and not simply the activity or proliferation of that order itself. As in the Foucauldian analysis, whereby all interruption of power is but a play of solicitation and recapture. At the same time, it is obvious that a disruption cannot come from nowhere at all, as in Heidegger's despairing remark that only a God can save us. What I hope will emerge from a consideration of these thinkers is a grammar of disruption in Kenneth Burke's sense of the word, its aspects of agency, scene, agent, act, and purpose. So Agamben first. There are 2 important senses of disruption in Agamben's thought. First, there are the disruptions constitutive of sovereign power and indeed of Western politics itself. Paradigmatically, 1, the exclusion from the Greek polis of Zoe, bare anonymous life, and 2, the state of exception in which Zoe is then included or recaptured as the object of political power by the sovereign's decision. This decision concerns homo sacer, the figure of bare life, always already excluded from the juridical order, but entirely vulnerable in the suspension of that order to sovereign power in homo sacer's capacity to be killed. So if exception is taken as a kind of disruption, brutally wrenching, and this at an explicitly metaphysical level, wrenching law out of nature, relation out of being, act out of potentiality, and so on, This is not a one-time affair, but rather an ongoing violence. Drawing on Walter Benjamin, Negri, and Schmidt, Agamben refuses to separate the legality and effectivity of political order, as constituted, for instance, by a social contract, from an excessive and all-encompassing constituting power. Disruption, therefore, characterizes power itself. Or, as Agamben cites Pasolini, quote, "The true anarchy is that of power," end quote. For this reason, Agamben sees no ultimate distinction between democracy and totalitarianism, but rather an inner solidarity between them. To do battle on the terrain of legality, rights, and constitutionalism would already be to give away the game, since these terms are irreparably tainted from the outset. This sweeping condemnation of all politics since Aristotle as metaphysically contaminated would appear to be supported by the painstaking philological exactitude of Agamben's textual exegesis. I at least am in no position to dispute his readings of Proclus or Gregory of Nyssa, but his conclusions are utterly paralyzing. First, this is my critique. First, his negative critique completely eschews any work upon what Gillian Rose calls the broken middle, the framework of institutions and their flawed actual configurations. Importantly, Agamben's point is not to roll back the exercise of the state of exception, to restore to the sovereign only the ordinary powers of a constituted and limiting authority, since for Agamben the problem goes all the way back. The state of exception is simply the constitutive paradigm of the juridical order come to light. So the Nazi death camps stand as a permanent horizon for the entire political space of modernity. When Agamben comes to his positive proposals, they also sound like disruption. His characteristic vocabulary is of deposing, deactivation and inactivity, destituent potential, and other syntactical conjurations. It is clear that Agamben intends inoperativity and the like to disable or disrupt the force of law, where law is crossed out or under erasure, as Heidegger sometimes crossed out the word being. But what do we know about inoperativity? What kind of notion is it? How could we discern its operations? And by what criteria would we judge whatever it brought about? At times, when Agamben connects the state of exception to the very structure of linguistic signification, we are as if returned to Nietzsche's saying that we are stuck with God as long as we hold on to grammar. Thus, inoperativity remains a transcendental postulate, a trace of the timeless auto-differentiation of metaphysical impositions, structurally prior to, yet inaccessible by, our categories of experience and evaluation. What remains as the fundamental ontologico-political problem today is the exhibition of the ceaseless void that the machine of Western culture guards at its center. It's a quote. This exhibition is something like the coming into view of the behind structure of undetermined life in its unwelcome vulnerability and affliction, as much a figure of abjection as of contingency. Hence the emphasis on bearing witness, as in Agamben's book on Auschwitz. As Christian Haynes has noted, this bearing of wounds, quote, without social and historical determination, can amount to nothing more than the valorization of unworldliness as such, end quote. But unworldly, I would add, in the strict sense of unavailable, unspeakable, and so forth. Now I am going to talk about Simone Weil. Agamben has said that the critique of law carried out in the Homo Soccer project has its roots in Weil's essay, translated in English as On Human Personality. So indeed, Agamben's dissertation was on Simone Weil's political thought, and he subsequently borrowed, without attribution, her concept of decreation for an essay on Melville's Bartleby. A lot of Melville today, I guess. In an introduction he wrote for a new French edition of On Human Personality, Agamben aligns himself with Simone Weil in three ways. Her situating of three ways. One, her situating of human affliction beyond the threshold of political and ethical thought. Two, her radical critique of the sphere of rights. And three, her thinking of the impersonal. But I would like to put some daylight between these figures. First, for Agamben, sovereignty is founded on an originary rupture and separation. All law, and even being itself, is subsequently conditioned by this epochal exclusion and violent partitioning. For Weil, however, her entire political and moral thinking depends on the continuity and the shared mechanism of social force with the inexorable necessity of physical laws, so that human mechanics for her is explicitly modeled on the law of gravity. She approvingly cites the reply of the Athenians to the delegation from Milo in Thucydides. Quote, "Tradition teaches us as touching the gods, and experience shows us as regards men, that by a necessity of nature, every being invariably exercises all the power of which it is capable." End quote. In affairs of power, therefore, there is never truly a rupture of continuity. Otherwise, it would not be power. So instead of Agamben's founding violence and disruption exclusion, Weil argues for a founding salvation built into creation itself, with God at both poles of sovereign and afflicted body. So in Simone Weil's account of the Passion, God went to the greatest possible distance, effecting a supreme tearing apart of his own being. And in between, there is only an uninterrupted anonymous necessity. The entirety of creation is nothing but mechanically harsh matter without disruption. Second difference. Whereas power for Agamben following Schmidt is centered on the decision, so that the sovereign wielding the exception really is the decider in George Bush's sense, for Weil, power is a sphere of blind impotence, since the stability of power, howsoever it may be the object of realist thinkers, she says is ultimately a chimera. Quote, "Those one calls masters, ceaselessly constrained to reinforce their power on pain of seeing it stripped from them, are only pursuing a dominance essentially impossible to possess." End quote. Because the nominal control of power is a hot potato, ever-changing hands, there is never truly a rupture of continuity. And across her writings, Weil sometimes supports this thesis with readings of Homer's Iliad, elsewhere the Bhagavad Gita, which she read in Sanskrit. Sometimes she credits it even as an insight of Marxism, citing Rosa Luxemburg's characterization of the incessant structural acceleration of capitalism, of capitalist accumulation as a carousel in the void. Lastly, Weil's term for disruption, decreation, insofar as it carries with it certain scholastic investments concerning the Trinity and necessity, is unrecognizable in Agamben's use of the same word. The difference here is that Weil is never a messianic thinker, whereas Agamben, in his commentary on the letter to the Romans, The Time That Remains, reads his own concept of a suspensive community into Paul's messianism. Weil's decreation is, by contrast, explicitly an imitation of Christ. Quote, "An imaginary divinity has been given to man so that he may strip himself of it like Christ did of his real divinity. God renounces being everything, we should renounce being something." End quote. So as Gillian Rose glosses Simone Weil's decreation, it is, quote, "to move out towards the world and to God without the recoil which is self and possession," end quote. Two important distinctions have to be made here. First, Weil's notion of decreating the self to make room for the non-subjective has nothing in common with the ontological celebration of contingency, vibrancy, and quantum indeterminacy in matter. It is central, rather, to her thinking of the limitations of power, that matter lacks any agency of its own, that it be sheer limit. She says, all forces, which are for her the opposite of agency, all forces are material. And in this respect, she is an unreconstructed Cartesian dualist. Second, decreation should be strongly distinguished from projects of anti-essentialism or deconstruction that amount to a negative theology of identity, where the dismantling of fixed and stable identity either valorizes ephemerality and performativity, or persists in the dour contemplation of identity's impossibility or failure. I'm being schematic only to say that for Weil, such postures still take up the space of the canceled self. whether in its wreckage of non-coincide of its, sorry. For Weil, such postures still take up the space of the canceled self, whether in its wreckage of non-coinciding or its unmoored improvisations. Decreation is rather to imagine that God, quote, loves that perspective of creation which can only be seen from the point where I am. But I act as a screen. I must withdraw so that he may see it, to see a landscape as it is when I am not there, end quote. By contrast, the deconstructed or radically undone identity is, on her interpretation, like a piece of disassembled home exercise equipment, stubbornly filling up a corner of the closet or spare bedroom, but not truly done away with. That is to say, for Weil, the only possible disruption is to really clear the space of the self. Her sense of decreation is not a nullity or a dialectic, but the space for the only possible freedom, that of grace. Disruption is therefore a subtraction, a kind of dropping out of the reign of force or implacable material domination. Identity, then, even under erasure, still belongs to mechanics. Like Agamben, Alain Badiou's figure of disruption, the event, goes back to a pre-ontological void or indifferent multiplicity, which has to be thought before its objectivation in a specified world. Because being qua being is absolutely homogeneous, there is always some originary element from the multiplicity of the void, which is struck by inexistence. But where these are all quotes from Badiou. But where the inexistent comes to exist with the maximal value, we are dealing with an event, namely a sort of delicate and implacable break in the laws that govern appearance. In such moments, what organizes the distribution of the intensities of existence and of the urgencies of action changes in an essential way. In his book, The Communist Hypothesis, Badiou specifies, quote, an event is not the realization of a possibility internal to the situation or dependent on the transcendental laws of the world. An event is the creation of new possibilities. Likewise, in his new book, In Praise of Politics, he describes the political event variously as invention, creation, or experimenting, putting on the agenda something affirmative or positive. So, to run Badiou over the same ground as with Agamben and Weil, on the issue of an originary rupture and separation, to Agamben, or a completion of being in creation, Weil, Badiou sides with Weil. Being qua being is undisturbed presentation, undisrupted, to use his vocabulary. Also like Weil, Badiou does not grant state power, the democratic legal order of which Agamben is so suspicious. He doesn't grant it any real control or decision, since the real is simply the careening of capital, heedless of any authority, of any such authority. When it comes to decreation, however, Badiou is on one side and Weil and Agamben on the other. For these two, the entire field of active intervention is fallen, already given over to force or relation. For Badiou, however, the event is a commandment to work on the consequences of the new. The imperative is not so much that an objective agent should be transformed into a subjective power, as in traditional Marxism, but rather the enforcing of, quote, shocking displacements, material and mental. The ultimate objective for Badiou, as with Hegel and Lukács, is a normative concept of self-determination as negativity. Not only does the subject not disappear in disruption, but, he says, the political subject historicizes itself in its own deployment. Here I would push back against Badiou for what I see as his ultra-leftism. The disruption is to come about from the subjectivizing or the self-organizing of the inexistent, its becoming rather than its positive availability as agent. I'm thinking here of Lenin's scathing rebuke, left-wing communism and infantile disorder, where he says, we can and must begin to build socialism, not with abstract human material, or with human material specially prepared by us, but with the human material bequeathed to us by capitalism. But when Badiou speaks of the internationalized nomad proletariat, the deracinated population internal to each country's workforce, he never interprets this figure in terms of political economy. the specific forms of exploitation, expanded reproduction, and modalities of capital that require and condition this figure, but only as a mass now laying disassembled in fragments and detachments to be organized. In other words, the disrupting figure is all too self-creating and voluntarist, precisely what Lenin is warning against. Elsewhere, Badiou says that Marx never got around to an exhaustive consideration of class and capital. What he misses here is that class itself is completed by capital, is transformed as a concept. Further, he doesn't see how class is reproduced by capital, so that the proletariat is not simply a point of radical negativity. This is, again, to make disruption all too subjective and transcendent. I realize in saying this, I am only repeating an old chestnut. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. Okay, to wrap up. What does all this have to do with Trump taking these three thinkers together? First, at the level of language, we should be circumspect about the metaphors and the ontology behind the twofold characterization of Trump as disruptive and the right-minded as the resistance. For the philosophers I've been discussing, there can be nothing truly new or liberating so long as we remain within the domain of physical forces and their interaction or law-like consequences, what Badiou calls being's prohibition of the event. Second, and closely related, these authors all criticize the discourse of rights. The entire field of rights and claims about rights is always already fallen, and the gaining and securing of rights as such is a game not worth the candle. In this sense, they are all the heirs of Marx's criticism of Bruno Bauer. Now, one consensus about Trump is that his administration is stampeding over rights, with the Muslim ban, the moves to suppress voting rights, the ban on transgender persons in the military, the rights of the press, abortion, and so on. On the other hand, the reactionary forces make their own claims in terms of rights, as in their attack on affirmative action, which they don't present as nakedly racist, or the frequent appeal to the Second Amendment. Then there is the worry that Trump is stacking the courts with conservative judges for an entire generation to come. So I flag this as an open question, where we stand with rights today. I will only add that the Black Lives Matter movement, which dates from Obama, but is the true north of all anti-Trump activity, is not in its basic claim about rights. It really is close to the distinction Weil makes between the person of rights claims and the way a human being counts. This is in her essay on human personality. Third, and following from the criticism of the subject of rights raised by all three authors, what different kind of political subjectivity do they envision? Here they are strangely unanimous, if enigmatic. Citing St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, but winking all the time at Lacan, Badiou urges that one must therefore assume the subjectivity of refuse. I think this word came up in an earlier talk. For Agamben, bare life, and for Simone Weil, the afflicted are synonyms for refuse. As I read these authors, these are their terms for the positive subjective figure of disruption or disturbance, basically for political possibility. I've also criticized these authors for their illegitimate derivations of this figure as a mere ontological postulate. In closing, I want to suggest a path that conceptual research might take, which is to rigorously show how this negativity, this refuse, this figure of disruptive injury is produced even as an outside or as unincorporable by the grind of material causality. But precisely here, we have to leave these thinkers behind and turn to a different kind of analysis of the specific form of negativity produced and reproduced by the dominant order. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking the Audie for the invitation to think aloud about this particular concept, word, one which is complex, that is disobedience.
Microphone.
That is, I want to begin by thanking Audie and others for inviting me to think aloud about disobedience. I would begin with two epigraphs. One is an epigraph by the reggae singer Bob Marley from his song Babylon System, and where he says, "We refuse to be what you want us to be. We are what we are, and that's the way it's going to be." End of quote. The second is from the Greek mythology Prometheus, where he says, "I would rather be chained to this rock than be an obedient servant to the gods." I use those two, one Greek mythology, the other one 20th century Rastafarian thinking, because I think the question of disobedience is a central political issue for today's world. To think about disobedience is obviously to think about obedience. Why do we obey? And how are we obedient? The why is obviously related to a long history in Western political theory. It has to do with questions of sovereign power and the relationship of sovereign power to issues of representation. And it also has to do with the questions of how law are constituted and how we are represented within the so-called constitutive order. It also has to do with political order and how we can break political order or how we obey in political order. All of that, in my view, circles and is constructed around some notion of representation that is held together by an idea of political equality. The question of how we obey, not just why now, but how we obey, is perhaps a little bit more problematic. In Western thought, the question of obedience, as Foucault makes very clear in his essays on how subjects and power, really relates to questions of what he calls pastoral power, salvation of the soul, and the confessional and the relationship between confessional and submission. Within the liberal self, the issue is not so much submission, but rather a certain kind of self-regulation, a certain kind of ways in which we have to develop techniques of rule which requires hegemony or certain forms of interpellation a la Althusser's formulation. Of course, there is another tradition of thinking around questions of obedience and disobedience, particularly in the United States. It is around the business of civil disobedience, Henry Thoreau and others, and the ways in which he begins to think about what does the civil mean and what does, when you put civil and disobedience together, what exactly are you calling for? I would argue that Thoreau's work, which is in the 19th century, really has some influence, but perhaps the sharpest postulation of forms of civil disobedience can be seen in the work of Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, who argued that the Constitution was made in hell and therefore should not be obeyed, or can be seen in the work of various black abolitionists, can be seen in the ordinary ways in which runaway slaves attempted to run away, or can be seen in the various Maroonage communities that were formed in the Americas, in the Caribbean and Latin America, and the way in which these Maroonage communities disobeyed the actual plantation economy and attempted to set up alternative forms of sovereignty. My argument here, though, is that in the 19th century, the question of disobedience, particularly in the Americas, really was also tied to an ethical question, was tied to whether or not the law was right, was tied to whether or not, even if the law was right, was it morally wrong, and therefore should we obey? Obviously, the question at that point in time was the business of slavery. And therefore, the argument was around a certain kind of constitutive power and whether or not constitutive power had a moral efficacy that we should actually obey, or that some people should obey. Disobedience in this particular thing thought about in this way is related to the questions of what kind of conscience do we have, is related to questions of moral authority. And even if you fast forward to the 20th century and think about the work of Martin Luther King and the way in which King thinks about disobedience and its relationship to nonviolent action is some kind of positivity against Jim Crow, that underlying his understanding of nonviolence and disobedience as a form of disobedience was whether or not the law was right, or whether underneath that, so it wasn't about the law was right, but whether or not the law was morally just. And therefore, from that perspective, he would then argue that one needs to disobey. And if you read particularly his letter to the clergy people, letter from Birmingham jail, you will see a defense of a certain kind of disobedience that has to do with questions of with a certain moral assumption, a certain ethical understanding. And therefore, it would seem to me that thinking through this question often, we think of disobedience as a matter of ethics, a matter of ethics working against some form of wrong. I want to make another move and to think about disobedience not just as ethics, but as a form of explicit political action, as a refusal to be ruled, not just for moral reasons or for wrongs, but really as a refusal to be ruled in a certain way at all. And that is a disobedience, therefore, as a form of action, which is generative of freedom as a set of practices. I begin this thinking this way by making a set of very quick distinctions between resistance, rebellion, revolt, and revolution. There is a clear relationship between these three concepts and practices: rebellion, resistance, revolt, and revolution, and their enactment. But all of these, in my view, are tied together, or circle around, if you wish, around some notion of refusal, around a notion of disobedience. And it is around a notion of disobedience that then leads on to the creation of something else. In sociology, there's all these books, and we know them by heart, in which people think about rebellion, revolt, resistance, and revolution as part of some historical process in which revolution is the pinnacle, opening a certain kind of logic in which Anna Arendt would say, describing modern revolutions, that new beginnings could occur. Obviously, disobedience calls forth resistance, and if necessary, rebellion and revolution. It is therefore a matter of a refusal that says no. It is a negative which calls forth a certain kind of positivity. It is a negative which is generative of certain kinds of action. To have disobedience, in my view, requires the following three things. There are many more, but I would do three. Firstly, it requires a certain break in the consensual forms of governmentality. Secondly, it requires a certain breach in politics. That is, in the politics of the moment, the ways in which the politics of the moment is not able to legitimize itself. And thirdly, it requires a certain breach in hegemony. That is a breach in what Gramsci would call common sense, or what I increasingly am calling the regularity of the everyday norm. And therefore, thinking about the shift of disobedience as a form of radical political action, I want to make a set of general statements about the conjuncture in which we live. I don't want to give a talk on this, so what I want to do is reduce some of these things to a set of theses, and then we can take it from there. Thesis 1, human life today, and these are all general statements and therefore subject to critiques, etc. But it is, I think, important just to put them on the table and then we can discuss them. Human life today has become saturated with the figure of the Homo economicus. Homo economicus as modes of life, governed, in fact, by a certain kind of neoliberal ideology. In this, what I'm arguing is that neoliberalism is not simply a matter of political economy, but is also a fundamental ideological force. And that fundamental ideological force is about the creation of subjectivities. So that's my first argument. Second, and we can see this in many ways, and we can talk about this. Thesis 2. At the core of this form of life is a certain kind of understanding of individual freedom, in which freedom is essentially understood as freedom from. And here I'm just paraphrasing Aya Berlin's 60s lecture. And it is understood as a freedom from, but understood as a central drive. This particular form of individualism, I would argue, really revolves around questions of choice. And then choice is collapsed into freedom. And I think that one has to think through very carefully the ways in which we have been thinking about freedom in the last 20, 30, 40 years, and how it has actually, in the popular mind, becomes collapsing, not just in a certain form of consumerism, i.e. how many soaps you're going to buy, or etc., what toothpaste you're going to have, and so on and so forth, and that sort of business, but really has collapsed into just this choice. What choice do you have? And that what is fascinating is even to think about the African-American struggle and to think about the ways in which at a certain moment in the early 21st century, the Madison Street or advertisements can now come and essentially argue that the African-American and the black freedom struggle, which has a long genealogy, really now ends up in just choice. So where can you choose to live, which you still can't because of segregation, but about what car you can have, what hairstyles you can wear, what makeup, and so on and so forth. And now, so everything, the equation of choice, or the collapsing of freedom around questions of choice, and circling around individualism, not individuality, but individualism is, in my view, another thing that we need to think about. Third thesis is the creation of what I call a bias politicus. That is moving beyond Foucault's notion of the biopolitics and to essentially think of the bias as ways of life. And in thinking about the bias as ways of life is to think about, therefore, the ways in which power has to up imperial power, but power has to create a certain kind of subjectivity. My argument around this business of ways of life and the creation of certain subjectivity, it draws actually from my understanding of the colonial problem, or what some people would call the colonial problem. And that is the ways in which colonial power had to operate at certain moments of its history to actually create subjectivities. In other words, colonialism operated by might is right. We all know that. Knocks people on the head, right? Without might is right, it doesn't operate. It doesn't have a certain force. But if you follow closely, and here I'm thinking particularly of the British colonial project, and if you follow closely that particular project, and after the emancipation of slaves in the so-called British Empire, after 1838, you would begin to see a distinct shift in colonial policy, particularly coming out of University of Oxford, and the way, and then there was what I call a revolving door between who had the best theory about solving the colonial problem at Oxford. Chairs were given in what was called political economy, and then those persons end up in the colonial office as secretary, all right? So those of us who think that sometimes the academy and politics are far, are distant, should probably think a little bit more. But the ways in which, what is interesting is to watch, is to read these accounts, all these particular lectures given by these persons. And one of my favorites is a man called Herman Merivale, who became colonial secretary, and who was a chair, had a chair in political economy at Oxford. And the heart of that argument runs as follows: that essentially the slaves were the people who were no longer slaves were now had to be considered as a new category of persons. And that secondly, if they were considered to be a new category of persons, the issue was going to be how would we rule them as subjects, not as citizens. And therefore, there then developed a set of arguments about the technologies of rule for these people to change their subjectivity to make them into something else. And the way some of us have called it is that what you had to create was the Christian black, a Christian respectable black. That is a person who was particularly a male figure, who would go to church and not practice any more Afro-Christian things, who would married and who would have a certain domestic arrangement, and who would dress a certain way, and so on, and what he or she had to wear. And there's a book published by Duke, which a group of us have been trying to think about this, it should be out in May, trying to think about this, called Victorian Caribbean, in which we think a lot about the actual ways in which people were dressing, what people wore at weddings, what people wore to school, etc., as a way in which a certain subjectivity was actually being formed. And it is therefore this technology of trying to form subjectivities, of making people now who are no longer slaves, but making them subjects, but yet they're not citizens. It is therefore this attention to subject formation, which Foucault makes so clear in Subject and Power. It is that attention that I would want to argue is important in this particular at this particular moment. What is also thesis 5, following from that, is as follows: that if the operationalization of a certain kind of governmentality is around the power in which we have to create new subjectivities, then I would want to suggest that in such an operation of power, ideology works as fantasy. And it is this understanding of ideology working as fantasy that if I could spend a minute on, because I would want to suggest that what you are looking at is a way in which these subjectivities are formed around a certain kind of set of ideas, around a certain set of ideologies, but this ideology is not in the way we used to think of ideology in the Marxian or even in the Gramscian sense, that it actually has become a certain kind of fantasy, right? And it becomes therefore more difficult to dislodge. It is not therefore, let me show you the right thing, or even let you even engage in a certain form of struggle that will then dislodge you from that certain subject position. In that, fantasy operates in a different way. So I would want to, for example, suggest to you that anti-black racism, which is at the heart of the authoritarian populist project in this country. So we're talking about Trump. And I just picked up a book yesterday written by a very famous historian who I will not name, who's writing a lot about populism in the United States and Europe. And I read it very quickly last night because I was actually looking for an argument, a historical and political argument that would try and understand populism and its relationship to forms of anti-black racism. And I saw no such argument. What I saw were people saying, yeah, this was xenophobic, yes, this is so, yes, there was racism and so on and so forth. But to understand authoritarian populism, in particular its American variety, is to understand a certain ways in which populism emerges in the late 19th century in this country. The debate in the populist movement between the Colored Farmers Union, with 1 million black people, at the end of Reconstruction, and the Farmers Alliance, and that the Farmers Alliance, both having a set of ideas about agricultural reform, but the Farmers Alliance making a case for what? For segregation in the movement itself. Arguing that there is a way that all organizations need to have that. And so you then have to ask yourself, at what moment does a certain kind of populism becomes defeated by anti-black racism? And how that then re-emerges in this country and becomes the ground, the fantasy, in which what? In which a certain kind of code can always be spoken without you seem to be racist. You just have to speak in code because the fantasy has already constructed the code and constructed the ways in which people then think about themselves and their certain kind of and their certain subjectivities. If that is so, then my argument is really this. Firstly, that in such a context, one has to think about what does a radical political practice look like. And if one begins with thinking through the business of the self, then I think that it is important to understand that the self then has to begin to understand that it has to dislodge itself from a certain regulatory activity that has become part of itself for hundreds of years in this society. That's the first thing. Secondly, I would want to argue that as the self has to do that, then it has to think about questions of disobedience. But it has to think about questions of disobedience as a way in which it confronts the customs and the conventions of both rule and ideological fantasy. And here, what I'm talking, this is what this is, I would just say how I came to this position. Mr. Trump has been in office for what, 11 months, etc. What is clear to me, and I was part of this, is that that there is protests. But what is also clear to me is that any kind of holding back has not to do with protests, but actually has had to do with inter-party squabbles, or has had to do with the conventional politicians trying to hold, the liberal politicians trying to hold back what they see something they don't necessarily agree with that. And therefore, the question that strikes me is not that we shouldn't have protests. I'm on the street, yes. The question to me, therefore, is that what do you now need to do? Right? What other forms of protest, what other forms of action, political action, one now needs to think about to do that will, use the word disrupt in quotation marks, but will actually disobey what is there. In other words, the point I am trying to raise is that we need to think about disobedience and political disobedience as a form of political action that will, in my view, create the possibilities of something else. And what I'm saying is that to think about disobedience, therefore, is to think about a certain form of refusal, not for us to go off into some space where, a few of us say, okay, I ain't living here. I have friends, quite frankly, who have left this country, who have gone back home. Some people are not even my friends, but I give you, Wally Sainka has packed up. He says, I ain't staying here. And he's gone to South Africa. So that there are people who are doing that as a certain kind of, I will not live here. Not ordinary people can't do that. Those of us who are noted intellectuals can pick up and do whatever we want, but ordinary people can't do that. So the question that faces us, in my view, in thinking about politics in the Trump area and thinking analytically, is what then do we need to do? What forms of action are we talking about that we should encourage, or what forms of action can bring the kind of shift that we need? In other words, and I think I'm arguing for certain forms of disobedience. In other words, radical politics does not, in this period, or this conjuncture to use that word, does not necessarily begin in the way Jacques Rancière says it, when the part of no part speaks. That radical politics actually may begin with the questions of refusal, may begin by us saying no, may begin by us saying no and positing with our radical imagination alternative epiphanies of possibilities. To do so, though, is to actually act in concert with others. We are at a juncture, I would argue, not of a kind of representative sovereignty, and therefore conventional modes of politics that might suffice. We are in a space, not just in this country, but elsewhere, I would argue, not just in a Harentian dark times, but we are in a space, a particular political space and a political conjuncture when I would argue human life on the planet is threatened. And I'm not just talking about climate change. That's there, and that's something that one needs to think about, and how actually we also do disobedience around that. We are not perfect beings, and we will never be. But I think that at this moment, there is the necessity in our social world to actually do and to make something else. And to do that, I think we start with a certain refusal and to think about disobedience and its forms. Thanks.
Questions, comments? I'll keep it queue. Let's start with Nick, and then Zahid.
So my question is for Anthony, and I want to thank you for finally putting the issue on the table. We sat here all day, and we're finally talking about what we're going to do about this situation. I thank you for that. I think it's really important that we don't leave this room before we have that conversation seriously. And I wanted to ask you about how you feel about what nonviolent civil disobedience means in a regime where the kind of practice that King and his generation trained for and put into practice of making the suffering body visible through national media to the legislature clearly doesn't work. I mean, that clearly doesn't work. I mean, we can be beaten up all day long by the cops, and they're really not going to worry about it. But we do have some clues, right? I mean, we know that we need to say Black Lives Matter. We know that water is life, that no human is illegal, that no human is property. These seem to be places we can start. But what I'd be really curious to hear you think about a little bit is what your sense is of the actual forms of action that you believe in this moment right now, which all of us are talking about, I think, in meetings and in our collectives and in the work that we're trying to do. Where should we be putting our bodies? What should we be doing with our voices? What kind of gesture counts? What's enough? What's too little? I mean, this is a lot to ask you, but you put these theses out there, and I want to hear what you have to say to that.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. And I know that this would, when I finished writing this 2 days ago, I knew that it would invite these kind of questions, right? And so, thanks. And this is what I would say. Firstly, is that what I am trying to do is to think about what drove me to this is to think about protests and the normal marches and so on that we have all had, and which I've participated in some. And I'm trying to think, okay, it's like it doesn't matter. There's a certain legitimacy. There's a certain way in which it is accepted. So the police will, say, you go over there, you go over there, you spend 2 days, some of us may get a little angry and throw some bottles, etc., but then that's it. So, and then, people, the debate would be, yes, everybody has the right to protest, okay? Although some, some conservatives would say, yeah, but some people are troublemakers, but there's a basic understanding that everybody has the right to protest, even if Trump and Bannon have a kind of skewed view of this, right? And so it strikes me, therefore, that protest then becomes normalized in such a situation. And therefore, what else what then do you need to do? And you put it right. Where then do you put your body? What what is the kind of gesture that you then need to make? And it struck me that, I mean, going back to some American political traditions, both black and conventional, that this idea of disobeying, of what Ida B. Wells calls troubling the waters, right? Of making sure that your body and your actions and so on disrupt the norms, and I'm using that word in quotation marks, disrupt the norms, do not necessarily obey the laws, right? That makes a point that it is not business as usual. This is the point, right? One of the things about the South African things, and I came in when people were talking about it, is that, I spent a lot of time there and I have a lot of arguments with folks there. But one of the things that those kids were trying to do was to say, this is not business as usual. All right? So I may have disagreement at them burning down artwork. I work on art, so I may have a disagreement. But they were making the point, this is not business as usual. How do we make the point that this is not business as usual? Right? And that's where I am. So I can't say to you, I think we should do A, B, C, D, or E. Right? I actually think that's a set of collective discussions that people need to have to think about this. All I'm trying to say is, let's put on the table, it's not business as usual. And if we're putting that on the table, then the question of disobedience becomes central to it, and how you carry it out. Not in the way that King and other folks, or even the SNCC people did in the Southern Freedom Movement, what we now call the Civil Rights Movement, mistakenly, right? As when we have hegemonized it and so on, and given it a certain narrative. But what form, and I would just end this. They came to that form by a set of experimentations and debate and discussion. It wasn't one person. I mean, some of us are doing a thing on Rosa Parks at the moment, bringing our house here and so on, and that has led me to meet a whole set of people and talk to people in the movement, and it becomes clear that that this wasn't something on one person's head. It was a big discussion, big quarrels, big fights about where can we do this, how should we do this, and so on, with some of the most profound arguments, quite frankly. And so my call would be for that kind of discussion and debate of trying to put on the table, it's not business as usual, what do we do? And also, let me just, sorry, also don't then find ourselves in another conventional term. So that, for example, there are friends of mine, academics and colleagues, who says, we're in fascism. And we're in fascism. And I kind of said, whoa, hold on a bit. All right? So in other words, part of trying to say it's not business as usual is to think hard and concretely about what is the moment that we are in. The hardest intellectual political work to do is not the historical analysis. That's what we're trained to do, and the philosophical one. That's what we are all in this room trained to do. The hardest analysis is, what is this moment?
Yeah, this is just a question for Ben. I was intrigued by your statement early on, which I'm about to mangle, so you can correct me. But it seemed to me that the emphasis that you were placing in your thinking about disruption was on subjectivity. You made a statement about this categorically. And I wondered about scale, because it seems to me that disruption, when it affects world historical events or affects large communities, it's often not about subjectivity, and it seems to be happening at a scale that is not the subject. And so I was wondering if you could make some of that bridge for me. I just wanted to invite you to say more about subjectivity and why you want to emphasize that.
Thank you. I certainly didn't mean the subject as the individual. I brought in, for a second, Hegel as just an instance of someone for whom the subject is not the individual. Lukács, I mentioned also. I think the position that Badiou is another person. So the position that Badiou has arrived at in his most recent, hot off the press works is He says, you know, humanity must determine itself. So it's a sense of, I was thinking of, for Hegel, Lukács, Badiou, there's a normative sense of self-consciousness as negativity, or the negativity of self-consciousness. But there is in that, you know, that self-consciousness is able to determine itself. Lisa is not here right now, so I can mention freedom. There's you know, the freedom to realize a subject at that magnitude. And I'll just explain what I mean by that. Obviously, under capitalism, no one has any determination of will at all. Where, I mean, it's let's say we had a completely planned economy. I'm not advocating for this, but that would be, you know, a sort of conscious determination, a planning in some, you know, even Stalinist way. That would be a self-conscious determination. And it's playing under capitalism. You know, no one has that. We're subject to forces that we don't have control over. And Badiou, in speaking of the subject at the level of humanity, intends something like ultimately a self-determination at that order. Does that make sense? Though I feel like.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. But I just wonder whether for Hegel, the negativity that constitutes the subject is a kind of disruption. It seems the negativity that constitutes the subject in Hegel would seem to me the order of the day, and not disruption, but rather. Yeah. Anyway, we can talk afterwards.
Yeah. Like I don't think so. So.
Yeah, okay.
So I have King, Lubaba, and Joe.
So I have a different question for each speaker. Is that too indulgent? Okay. Sorry. So Ben, I was wondering if the kind of thing disruption isn't, or say Badiou's, the one that's wrought on subjectivity by, say, Badiou's notion of an event, right, the creation. I wonder if much of what's driving that notion of disruption in Badiou, but others as well who might, is precisely to say something that's not of a piece with what Hegel and Marx say. Because it's very important for say, historical materialism and the more idealistic version which it inverts, that its transformation comes from an internal dialectic, which is deliberative. You know, there's a contradiction and you deliberate your way out of it to new transformed subjectivities. But a disruption isn't that, right? It isn't part of an internal dialectical narrative of that kind. It's really more like the shift in episteme or a Kuhnian paradigm shift or something like that. So in a way, it's precisely defined as being different from the Marx-Hegel conception of transformation. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct,
Right.
yes.
Okay.
What I wanted to say...
Good, nothing like a straightforward answer. I didn't want...
That's exactly correct about Badiou. I wanted to end by talking about Badiou. I mean, the end of the paper, I say what we need is... I criticize him precisely for being an ultra-leftist in this way. He pulls his subject and his event, I think, you know, insufficiently from material dialectic. And again, Lisa isn't here, but what happened in the end of her talk was very much congenial to what I intended, which she went so deeply into the specific differences of how migrants come about, right? You know, hydroelectric dams, displacement by military installations, all sorts of different specific formations of a possible subject. And it's not, you know, stages of the dialectic there, I mean, unfolding in their timeless order, but I'm much closer to that than what Badiou is talking about, because Badiou, it seems underived to me. So does that answer your question? And so I would like to be closer to Hegel and Marx than Badiou is, precisely on these grounds.
I see. Okay. So, Anthony, I'm curious about the way you formulated the moment of disobedience as announcing a recoil from business as usual. And I'm just wondering if, so let us say, as in many cases, King, Gandhi, and others, that disobedience is to laws that are unjust. Let's take a case of unjust laws or oppressive laws. And one question that I was curious about is whether there's any sense on your own part, in the passage of your argument, as to whether its goal is something deeper than replacing it with other laws. Right? There are laws that you disobey because you find them oppressive or unjust. But in some sense, it's not merely to replace them with other laws, but to resist the idea that something like laws is where the truth lies. That is, resist the very idea that the law carries. So you're seeking a higher, higher is just invidious use of, I don't mean higher, but you're seeking something of a deeper kind, so that we are not simply given the impression that what's bad in us can be just made better simply by better laws.
Yeah,
Politics is a deeper business than that, right?
I mean, I agree with you, and what I'm trying to work through is to think about the relationship of disobedience to questions of freedom and freedom practices, right?
Yeah.
So that I'm not trying to think about that's the question of law alone, which is why I said it's a morally unjust law or so on, and then we say let's disobey it and hopefully we get a better one the next time, right?
Exactly.
That's not what I'm trying. I'm trying to think about the ways in which at this specific moment disobedience calls forth a certain questioning of self and society that will allow us to think about questions of freedom in a different way. That's what I'm trying to think through, because I'm arguing that the ways in which we constitute our subjectivities and our self and its relationship to freedom is one that is, quite frankly, a certain kind of narrow conception of freedom. Let me put it, I don't want to say it is not freedom.
Right.
It's a certain, I don't get into that kind of analytical game, but it is actually, it narrows our particular conception of ourselves and of life and what is possible. And that disobedience might open up a different way and different passages for us to begin to think through different things at this moment. That's all I'm trying to say. Thank you.
I have two questions, if that's all right. But the first is kind of relating back to the discussion about protests that we were having earlier. And I guess thinking about, I guess I'm not convinced that the protest is no longer a useful political tool, because I guess I would like to hear a little bit more about what is the purpose of protest, and also what do we mean when we say nonviolent protest, because as just the events of the past 11 months have shown, nonviolent protests are incredibly violent for some people, and people have died, and so can we really say that a peaceful protest is ineffective in kind of recognizing the fact that the regime we live under now is not business as usual? And then the second question I had was, I think about kind of the time in which we are allowed to name our present moment. I guess, Professor Bogues, I was curious about your comment about fascism, and you seem to express some reticence as to name our moment as a fascist moment. And I feel like I had a lot of discussions with colleagues, with other academics, who in the wake of the election seemed hesitant to name this particular moment a moment of white supremacy and ethno-nationalism and fascism. And I guess I don't see the political efficacy of waiting when it seems to be something that's very clearly transparent to some. So if you could speak to those two questions.
I think that it's not a question of political efficacy of waiting to name something. It is whether or not the thing that you are naming is actually politically, allows you to politically analyze what it is properly. And I actually think that the business of naming what you are under is a central political task. It's not something that is academic. It is, if you get it wrong, you actually develop wrong political tactics around it. One of the tendencies we have in America and elsewhere is that a regime that looks authoritarian, we immediately reach for a historical authoritarian description of it. Professor Meeks can testify to this. When we were both in Jamaica and a right-wing regime was appearing, we were a little younger then, we were all saying that this regime is going to be fascist. And both of us had reason to say that because both of us lost our jobs because of our politics. And we're told we couldn't work in that country again. And we therefore had right to say, this is a certain fascist regime. But it also surprised us, if we're honest, that over by 2-3 years, there were things that were happening that did not fit the actual model that we thought. And what that taught me as a political thinker and theorist, and then an activist, is how to name something. How to name something without reaching back for historical things. Using the history to make me understand how I may get there, but also beginning to understand a deeper history of a specific moment. And I would argue that this moment is a moment of authoritarian populism. And it is a moment of authoritarian populism in which white supremacy, and I've said it, and anti-black racism is the key mobilizing factor that operates as a fantasy for codes. So you don't have to say you are racist or anything. You just have to say certain things, and everybody knows in your head that you have anti-black racism, or you mean the migrant, or so on. So, you know, and so that we have to, in thinking about that, and as the moment unfolds, if we are political activists and so on, or thinkers, then in my view, one has to map it very, very, very carefully. 6 months from now or a year from now, certain things may happen and I may say, okay, but I don't think you are on the moment of a fascist thing. You're on the moment of an authority, you are in the moment of authoritarian populism and set up a political regime that will move in authoritarian directions, as already shown that it will move in authoritarian directions. And what is then interesting is that when you think about that, who then are your allies? Who are you going to politically help to mobilize around certain things? I also think there's a deeper question which I was trying to get at, which is the question of the kind of subjectivities that are formed and what is the politics of that subjectivity. So that's my response to the second part. The first part about protest is this. I am not saying protests must stop. You ask me to come on a march tomorrow, I'll come. My point is, can we look at protests and see how it might be normalized In other words, how it might be accepted by the status quo. Right? If the people complain, but that they say, okay, you have a right to protest. And that if it becomes normalized as part of a so-called liberal tradition, right, that is now changing itself into an authoritarian regime, then do we not then have to think, beside protest, what else must we do? That's all I'm saying. What else must we do? Because you can, you know what, I can't remember who said it, but you can have a situation where you march today, I call you back in. You march tomorrow, I call you back in. You march a third day, I call you back in. We ourselves who are marchers feel good. But if you kind of just reflect on what's the configuration of power and how power is moved itself, you then realize that you're marching for a whole month and not much has shifted. So, and it is not against marching, it's not against protests at all. It is against, it's just a call for saying we are in a new times, we are in a new moment, and we might want to think about new methods of political action. It's, I mean, I just, it's the, you know, it's, and again, I don't come from this by, you know, by just think. I come to this by reading very carefully what it is, the debates and so on that happen in this so-called civil rights movement. What is the form of action where there are people following? Why did they then move to certain other forms of action? Because certain things were not working, and somebody said, "Listen, let's try and do something else." Right? So a certain pragmatic realism, in my view, to think through some of the questions. I hope I get what I'm saying.
Do you want to respond, Ben?
Yeah, thank you. I'll respond also generally. I had some questions for Anthony that I will take this chance. About something that many people have spoken about today, about neoliberalism. I think you know, capitalism in general, it's hard to have a disobedient protest. I think this goes back to an earlier question about laws, you know, about justice that you were asking, which is I can say that the Constitution is written in hell. I can disobey certain very specific laws. If I was morally in favor of jaywalking, I could jaywalk and be arrested, and so this would concretize that. But you know, in the new tax bill that's, for all I know, been passed right now, there's a terrible clause about the tax rate for pass-through corporations, pass-through entities. How on earth can I disobey that law? So that, to me, that's the worst, you know, one of the worst things that's going to happen is, you know, millions of dollars, billions of dollars will be shuttled from the social, essentially, into the 1%. That's not something I can disobey as a, I don't even really know, you know, if it involves me as an individual at all. I mean, so this goes back to the question of an individual. If that's a law that pertains to corporations, I can neither, I could protest it, I suppose, but I can't disobey that law. I find it to be abhorrent, but it's not in the same plane of existence as obedience or disobedience. I, in fact, can't even obey the law. I can neither obey or disobey the corporate rate for pass-through entities.
I think actually you can make yourself into a pass-through corporation. Say that again? I think that Ben can make himself into a pass-through corporation, and then Brown University will pay your corporation, and then you will pay a lower tax rate. That's what's going to happen. It's not for IBM, it's not for Apple and so forth. It's for people who will do that.
So that would be obeying it, though. But
Well, but then, you said you couldn't do it because it had nothing to do with you, but we could go on a tax strike. People have in the past, most recently from the right, refused to pay their taxes.
Okay.
Yeah, I might just cut you off.
Oh, okay.
If you don't mind.
Let me, if I may finish and the other question I had was about the way that obedience and disobedience falls into the same kind of voluntarist aspect that I was criticizing in my paper. So instead of looking at the specific negativity, the specific conditions, the specific consequences, the specific kinds of subjects that are being produced by capital, and saying, you know, what new forms are there, and new subjects, and what can they do? To me, disobedience suggests a sort of subject possibly plucked from the air. So those are my two comments.
Thank you. I might just actually take 3 quick questions. No, we have.
I know, but basically they've been asked in some form.
Very well. Well, then I'll just take 2 questions together from Sarah and Claire, and give our speakers a chance to respond before we close shop.
Thank you to you both for your inspiring talk. Sorry for my English, but it's 1 o'clock in my mind, and so it doesn't help. Anthony, one question for you.
You still have to talk louder.
Sorry?
Your accent, how loud you're talking.
Okay. And you made me think about one Sartre phrase. I said it in French. He said, commander et obéir, c'est la même chose. Commanding and obeying is the same thing. So I think that is something quite useful for our project of political lexicon, because as you said, it seems that obeisance and disobedience are really not in the same semantic network. They are not just the passive and the active voice of same action. It's something radically, ontologically, essentially different of disobedience. And I was wondering if you see a link, a relationship with the question of desire, because you talked about freedom, and the question freedom is not just having choice. So I think that it could be interesting to explore this possibility.
Final question from Claire.
I think actually my question might echo yours a little bit, so it's good. And I'm going to chop off the part that you already asked, I guess. But so the simple question that I would add to this would be, you know, I find the provocation to think about disobedience in addition or beyond protest quite important. But I was wondering to what extent, and this is really an open question, and you know, I don't have a firm position myself on it. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Is, you know, in the last decade or so, it seems like more and more in the U.S., in France, where I'm from, you know, protest is actually often, very quickly, a form of disobedience, because the regulation of protests are more and more strict, right? And so, to what extent that boundary between the two, what work does it do to distinguish between the two still? You know, and I'm thinking, for example, of the Women's March last year. I went to the one in Boston, and the Boston Commons were completely packed, right? There were so many more people, and I think the organizers were actually counting on the numbers on Facebook, but I didn't register, right? Many people didn't register. And we got trapped in the Boston Commons. Many people left the march because they were feeling overwhelmed. I was with someone who was pregnant, and she didn't want to get stuck there. But I was baffled by the fear that the organizers and many protesters had to just not respect the course that had been set, just disobey, right, the plan, and the police that was there that was by very far outnumbered. Right? So I'm just wondering at what point disobedience and protest come together, and what might that do to our thinking about this together? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Let me respond quickly to Ben to say that for me, neither obedience nor disobedience are voluntary things. Obedience in late capitalism is about the capturing of desire and the imagination to create subjectivities. That's not you. It is it's an illusion, self-regulatory, but power is already constructed and created a certain terrain on which you are operating. That's not voluntarism, right? Disobedience, in my view, is also not voluntarism. In fact, it is actually calling upon yourself and others, because I don't necessarily believe in individual disobedience, although that's possible. It is calling upon self and others to engage in a certain action. And I think, as I tried to respond to a colleague question 2-3 questions ago, it is not just about disobeying the law. This is what I was trying to get us to move from. We think of disobedience only in relationship to law. I'm trying to think about disobedience as a political act that is about breaking norms and conventions, not just law, right? So that the law may actually be just, quote unquote, right? But the ways in which we are being ruled is a way that thwarts any kind of movement to an understanding of freedom, in my view. And I don't use the word emancipation deliberately. It's, for all sorts of reasons, but it is about trying to create freedom practices. And if it is about trying to create freedom practices, that to me requires a certain voluntarism, but it also requires, in my view, a certain kind of understanding of the social and working together. That, in my view, is something that we haven't done. It is what I like to call working in common association. Okay? In relationship to this business, to desire, you're absolutely right. I mean, they put the argument very simply, and this is why I ended up on the radical imagination, is that my feeling is that the ways in which neoliberalism, led capitalism works is actually to capture desire and therefore the imagination. And therefore to say nothing is possible. Because if you can't think outside of that box, the faculty of imagination does not think outside of the certain kind of convention in which we are in, then there's nothing possible. You don't have to hit us on the head. We just know that we can't do anything else. So therefore let's just continue. And why I like to say, let's have wine and drink, and you all be happy if we can, right? So the question of desire is, for me, is absolutely essential at this point in time. And I think that we have to begin to understand that that late capitalism and neoliberalism has moved from just trying to think through questions of exploitation, right? And therefore we have a proletariat and questions of creating ghettos and so on. It does all of those things. Foucault made it very clear. It does all those things, but I would argue it does those things plus. And the plus is to try and think about the way it operates in the world today and trying to create these new subjects, no matter where, quite frankly, no matter where we are. So yes, desire is critical. Yes, I agree. There is a relationship between protest and disobedience. I kind of split them so that, at 20, 25 minutes I was, thinking through that. I split them, but I also want to, I split them because I realize that process also requires disobedience. So you disobey police officer and you do certain things and so on. But I want to call for a more kind of deeper thinking around how can we disobey the norms and conventions of the life that we have been called to live, right? Of the kind of subjectivities that we have been subjects that we have been formed. And what does that mean to do that in a collective way, right? And I don't have the answer, but I'm trying to think through, is there a possibility of that? And also, I'm not saying that then creates revolution. Right? It may not, I don't know. What I do know is that, and what I think is that we have to begin to think about how to resist what has become of us. In other words, let me put it another way. We are, in my view, what I like to call modes of life. And those modes of life have turned us into something else. The question, in my view, is what then, is not just an epistemic question, as some of my friends and mentors think. What then do we need to do to think about alternative modes of life on this planet? That, to me, it calls for certain kinds of disobedience. Right? And what then happens after that, I don't know. Thank you very much.
Ben, do you have like a 10-second soundbite? Very well. Then please join me in thanking our speakers for one.